The military truck rolled through the gates of Fort Collins for the last time. Inside, a man named Jake stared out the window at the familiar buildings he'd called home for 8 years. His hands, rough and scarred from 3 tours overseas, gripped his duffel bag like it might disappear. After everything he'd been through, saying goodbye to military life felt like losing another piece of himself. Jake had joined the Army right out of high school. Back then, he thought he knew what courage meant. He thought he understood what it meant to serve his country. 3 deployments later, he learned that some battles follow you home. The nightmares started during his 2nd tour. By his 3rd, the sound of helicopters made his heart race even when he knew they were friendly. Now, at 32, he was heading back to Montana, to a small ranch his grandfather had left him. The place had been empty for 5 years, waiting for him to come back. His family thought civilian life would be easy after military service. They didn't understand that sometimes the hardest fight happens when the shooting stops. The ranch sat 20 miles outside of Whitefish, surrounded by mountains that touched the sky. When Jake first saw it again, he almost turned around. The house needed work. The barn was falling apart. Weeds had taken over what used to be his grandmother's garden. Everything looked tired, just like he felt. But there was something else waiting for him there. Something he never expected. On his 3rd day back, Jake heard noises coming from the old barn. At first, he thought it might be wild animals looking for shelter. Montana winters were brutal, and plenty of creatures needed warm places to hide. He grabbed a flashlight and walked carefully toward the sound. Inside the barn, he found a horse. Not just any horse, but a black stallion that looked like he'd been through his own war. The animal was thin, with burn scars running down his left side. His coat was dull, and his eyes held the same haunted look Jake saw in his own mirror every morning. Jake learned later that the horse had been rescued from a wildfire the previous summer. The local animal rescue had been looking for someone to take him, but nobody wanted a damaged horse. Most people wanted animals that were easy to handle, not ones that came with baggage. Jake understood that feeling perfectly. He started calling the horse Thunder, mainly because of the way his hooves sounded when he got spooked. And Thunder got spooked a lot. Loud noises, sudden movements. Even the wind hitting the barn door wrong could send him backing into the corner, eyes wide with fear. The first few weeks were rough. Jake didn't know much about horses, and Thunder didn't trust humans. They spent most of their time just existing in the same space, neither one sure what to do with the other. Jake would sit on a hay bale and read while Thunder stood in the far corner, watching him like he might disappear. Slowly, things started to change. Jake began bringing carrots and apples from town. He'd leave them near Thunder's food and walk away, giving the horse space to decide whether he wanted them or not. Eventually, Thunder started eating the treats. Then one morning, he didn't back away when Jake approached. Winter came early that year. By November, snow covered everything, turning the world into something quiet and clean. Jake found that the cold helped somehow. The crisp air made his mind feel clearer than it had in months. And Thunder seemed calmer too, like the snow muffled the sounds that usually scared him. They started taking walks together around the property. Jake would lead Thunder by a rope, both of them moving slowly through the snow-covered fields. These weren't real rides yet. Thunder still flinched when Jake moved too quickly, and Jake still jumped at unexpected sounds. But they were learning to trust each other. The walks became the best part of Jake's day. Out there in the quiet wilderness with only Thunder for company, he didn't have to pretend everything was fine. He didn't have to smile when people asked how he was adjusting to civilian life. He could just be himself, scars and all. Some days were harder than others. The nightmares still came, usually around 3 in the morning. Jake would wake up sweating, his heart pounding, thinking he was back overseas. On those nights, he'd walk out to the barn and sit with Thunder. The horse seemed to understand. He'd stand quietly nearby, his presence steady and calming. Jake started talking to Thunder during these midnight visits. He told him about the friends he'd lost, about the guilt that followed him everywhere, about how hard it was to feel normal again. Thunder never judged. He just listened with those dark, knowing eyes. As winter deepened, their bond grew stronger. Jake learned to read Thunder's moods, and Thunder learned that Jake wasn't going to hurt him. They were both healing, slowly and quietly, in the middle of nowhere, Montana. By December, Jake felt confident enough to put a saddle on Thunder. The horse stood perfectly still, like he understood this was important. Their first real ride lasted only 10 minutes, just a slow walk around the property. But for both of them, it felt like victory. The rides became longer as the snow got deeper. Jake discovered that Thunder had incredible instincts about the weather and the terrain. The horse could sense dangerous ice or unstable snow long before Jake could see it. More than once, Thunder stopped suddenly and refused to go forward, only for Jake to discover later that they'd been heading toward a hidden drop-off or a snow-covered hole. People in town started to notice the pair. The local feed store owner mentioned that he'd seen them riding the mountain trails, even in heavy snow. Some folks thought Jake was crazy for taking a horse out in weather like that, but Jake knew better. Those rides weren't just about exercise or fresh air. They were about survival. Out there in the wilderness, with thunder beneath him and mountains all around, Jake felt something he hadn't felt since before his first deployment. He felt peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from avoiding problems, but the kind that comes from facing them head-on and discovering you're stronger than you thought. Thunder gave him purpose. The horse needed care, needed exercise, needed someone who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds. And Jake needed something to focus on besides his own pain. They were saving each other, one careful step at a time. As January arrived, bringing with it some of the worst weather Montana had seen in years, Jake and Thunder were ready for whatever came next. They'd learned to trust each other completely. They'd learned that healing doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen, especially when you're not trying to do it alone. Neither of them knew that their next ride would change everything. Neither of them knew that all their practice navigating dangerous terrain and building trust would soon be put to the ultimate test. They just knew that tomorrow, like every day for the past few months, they'd face whatever came together. In the quiet of the Montana wilderness, with snow falling softly outside the barn, two broken souls had found exactly what they needed to start putting themselves back together. February came to Montana like an angry giant, bringing the worst blizzard anyone had seen in 20 years. The weather forecast called for 3 feet of snow and winds up to 60 miles per hour. Most people in Whitefish were smart enough to stay inside, stock up on supplies, and wait for it to pass. But Jake had learned that sometimes the worst weather brought the most peace. The howling wind seemed to quiet the noise in his head, and thunder actually seemed calmer during storms. So when the blizzard hit on a Tuesday morning, Jake made a decision that probably wasn't very smart. He decided to take Thunder out for their usual ride. They'd been riding the same trail for weeks now. It was a safe route that Jake knew well, winding through the forest about 5 miles from his ranch. The path was wide enough for Thunder to walk comfortably, and there were several places where they could turn around if the weather got too bad. Jake bundled up in his heaviest winter gear and led Thunder out of the barn. The wind immediately tried to knock them both over, and snow was falling so hard that Jake could barely see 10 feet in front of him. Most people would have turned back right then, but Jake had learned to trust Thunder's instincts, and the horse seemed ready to go. They started down their usual trail, moving slowly and carefully. Thunder's hooves found solid ground even when Jake couldn't see where they were stepping. The big black horse had an amazing ability to sense danger, and Jake had learned to let him lead when visibility was poor. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. They followed the familiar path through the trees, with Thunder picking his way carefully around fallen branches and icy patches. The snow was coming down harder now, but they'd been through worse weather together. Then something changed. About 2 miles into their ride, Thunder suddenly stopped. His ears went forward and his whole body became tense and alert. Jake knew this behavior well. It usually meant Thunder had heard or smelled something that didn't belong. Jake tried to urge Thunder forward, but the horse refused to move. Instead, he turned his head to the left, looking into the thick forest where there was no trail. Thunder had never done anything like this before. He was always careful to stay on safe paths, especially in bad weather. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, though the wind was so loud he could barely hear his own voice. Thunder took a step toward the trees, then looked back at Jake as if asking permission. This was completely unlike the cautious horse Jake had come to know. Thunder never wanted to leave the safety of the trail, especially not in a blizzard. Jake felt his military training kick in. In the Army, he'd learned to trust his gut feelings, even when they didn't make logical sense. And right now, his gut was telling him that Thunder was trying to tell him something important. Against every bit of common sense he had, Jake decided to follow Thunder's lead. He loosened the reins and let the horse choose their direction. Thunder immediately turned into the forest, moving with more purpose than Jake had ever seen from him. The going was much harder here. There was no clear path, just trees and fallen logs and snowdrifts that came up to Thunder's chest in some places. Jake had to duck constantly to avoid low branches, and more than once he thought about turning back. But Thunder kept moving forward like he knew exactly where he was going. They traveled like this for almost an hour. Jake's hands were getting numb inside his gloves and ice was forming on Thunder's mane. The storm was getting worse and Jake was starting to worry that they were lost. He was just about to insist they turn back when Thunder suddenly stopped again. This time he was looking down into a deep ravine that Jake hadn't even seen until they were right at the edge. The sides were steep and covered with snow, making it almost impossible to see the bottom. But Thunder was staring down into it like he could see something Jake couldn't. Jake dismounted and walked carefully to the edge, holding on to Thunder's reins. He had to wipe snow from his eyes several times before he could make out what Thunder had been looking at. There, about 30 feet down the slope, was a car. It was lying on its side, partially buried in snow. At first, Jake thought it was just an old wreck that had been there for years. But then he noticed that the snow on top of it was fresh and there were tire tracks leading to the edge of the ravine that hadn't been completely covered yet. Jake's heart started pounding. Someone had gone over the edge recently, probably within the last few days. In weather like this, anyone trapped down there would be in serious trouble. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted as loud as he could. "Hello, is anyone down there?"
Can you hear me?
The wind swallowed his voice, but he thought he heard something in response. A faint sound that might have been someone calling back. He tried again, shouting until his throat was raw. This time he was sure he heard something. A weak voice, barely audible over the storm, calling for help. Jake's mind raced. He was miles from the nearest road with no cell phone service and a blizzard raging around him. Even if he rode back to town as fast as possible, it would take hours to get help, and by then whoever was down there might be dead. But going down into that ravine was incredibly dangerous. The sides were steep and icy, and if he got hurt, no one would know where to find him. Plus, he'd be leaving Thunder alone in the storm, and the horse might panic and run off. Thunder seemed to sense Jake's dilemma. The big horse moved closer to the edge and looked down into the ravine again, then back at Jake. It was like he was saying, "We have to do something." Jake took a deep breath and made his decision. He couldn't live with himself if he walked away and let people die when he might have been able to save them. He'd seen too much death already. If there was even a small chance he could help, he had to try. He tied Thunder's reins to a sturdy tree and checked his gear. He had rope in his saddlebags, a flashlight, and some basic first aid supplies. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Before starting down, Jake took a moment to study the car more carefully. It was a small sedan, probably about 10 years old. The front end was smashed against a large boulder, and the driver's side was buried in snow. But he could see movement inside, shadows against the windows that meant people were still alive. Jake started his descent, using the rope to control his slide down the icy slope. Every step was treacherous, and twice he almost lost his footing completely. Above him, Thunder watched nervously, occasionally whinnying as if to encourage him. When Jake finally reached the car, he could hardly believe what he found. Inside were 3 people. A woman who appeared to be in her 40s and 2 younger females who looked like they might be her daughters. All 3 were conscious but clearly suffering from hypothermia. They'd been trapped in the overturned car for what looked like at least 2 days. The woman in the front seat looked up at Jake with eyes full of hope and desperation. "Please," she whispered through chattering teeth, "help my girls." Jake could see that all 3 were in bad shape. Their lips were blue and they were shivering uncontrollably. The car's heater had obviously stopped working, and their body heat was the only thing keeping them alive. Without immediate help, they wouldn't last much longer. As Jake assessed the situation, he realized that this rescue was going to be the hardest thing he'd ever attempted. Getting 3 hypothermic people up a steep, icy slope in the middle of a blizzard seemed almost impossible. But Thunder had led him here for a reason, and Jake wasn't about to let these people down. He looked up at his faithful horse, still waiting patiently at the top of the ravine, and knew that somehow together they were going to find a way to save these 3 lives. The question was whether they could do it before the storm got even worse, or before the cold claimed its victims. Jake knelt beside the overturned car, his mind racing through possibilities. The 3 women inside were barely conscious, their bodies shaking violently from the cold. The mother kept trying to speak, but her words came out as whispers between chattering teeth. Her two daughters, who looked to be teenagers, were huddled together in the back seat, their faces pale as snow. "How long have you been here?" Jake asked the mother, speaking loudly enough to be heard over the wind. 3 days, she managed to say. Maybe 4. Lost track. Jake's heart sank. 3 days in this weather, with no heat and limited supplies, was already a miracle they'd survived. But he could see they didn't have much time left. The youngest daughter's lips were turning blue and her shivering was becoming weaker. Jake knew from his military medical training that this was a bad sign. When the body stops shivering, it means it's shutting down. He had to act fast, but the situation seemed impossible. The car was wedged against a boulder, making it difficult to get the women out. The slope back up to where Thunder waited was steep and icy, and the storm was getting worse by the minute. Jake forced himself to think like a soldier. In the Army, they'd taught him that impossible missions become possible when you break them down into smaller steps. Instead of thinking about getting all 3 women to safety, he focused on the immediate problem, getting them out of the car. The driver's side door was completely blocked by snow and debris, but the passenger side was partially clear. Jake used his hands to dig away the snow, working as quickly as possible despite his numb fingers. After 20 minutes of digging, he managed to open the door wide enough to get inside. The smell hit him immediately. The women had been trapped in this small space for days, with no way to get fresh air or leave for basic needs. But Jake pushed past his discomfort and focused on what needed to be done. "I'm going to get you out of here," he told them, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say." The mother nodded weakly. "Are you real?" she asked. "We've been seeing things," Jake understood. Hypothermia could cause hallucinations, especially after days of trauma. "I'm real," he assured her. "My name is Jake, and I'm going to get you to safety." He started with the youngest daughter, who seemed to be in the worst condition. She was barely responsive, and Jake knew she needed immediate warming, or she might not survive the rescue attempt. He carefully lifted her from the back seat, wrapping her in his own heavy coat. Getting her up the slope would be the hardest part. Jake had brought rope, but it would be nearly impossible to carry someone while climbing that icy incline. Then he remembered something his grandfather used to do when moving hay bales in winter. Jake made his way back up to Thunder, carrying the girl as carefully as possible. The climb was exhausting, and several times he almost lost his footing on the slippery rocks. But Thunder seemed to understand the urgency. The big horse stayed perfectly still, even when the wind howled around them. At the top, Jake quickly fashioned a makeshift sled using the car's floor mats that he'd managed to pull loose. It wasn't much, but it would be better than trying to carry each person individually. He attached his rope to the front of the makeshift sled and secured the other end to Thunder's saddle. "Easy, boy," Jake told Thunder as he positioned the unconscious girl on the sled. "We're going to take this real slow." Thunder seemed to understand. The horse began walking away from the ravine with careful, measured steps, pulling the sled smoothly across the snow. Jake walked alongside, making sure the girl stayed secure and watching for obstacles. They made it about a quarter mile before Jake realized they had a bigger problem. The storm was intensifying and visibility was dropping to almost zero. Even with Thunder's incredible instincts, traveling in these conditions was becoming dangerous. But going back to the car wasn't an option either. Jake made a difficult decision. He found a large boulder that provided some shelter from the wind and stopped there. Using everything he'd learned about cold weather survival, he created a makeshift shelter using pine branches and his emergency tarp. It wasn't warm, but it would protect them from the worst of the wind and snow. He wrapped the girl in every spare piece of clothing he had and used his own body heat to warm her. Slowly her breathing became stronger, and some color returned to her face. She was still unconscious, but Jake felt her chances were improving. Now came the hardest part, going back for the others. Jake left the girl as comfortable as possible in the shelter and made his way back to Thunder. The horse had waited patiently despite the worsening conditions. As they headed back toward the ravine, Jake wondered if he was making a mistake. Every minute they spent out here increased the danger for all of them. But when they reached the edge again and Jake heard the weak voices calling from below, he knew he didn't have a choice. He couldn't leave those 2 women to die, even if trying to save them put everyone at risk. The second trip down was even more treacherous. The snow had made everything more slippery and Jake's energy was starting to fade. but he pushed through the exhaustion and managed to reach the car again. The older daughter was still conscious, though barely. She helped Jake get her mother out of the car, though both women could barely stand. Jake knew this trip would be much more difficult. Two people would be much harder to manage on the sled, and both were awake enough to feel fear about what was happening. "I know this is scary," Jake told them as he helped them onto the sled back at the top. "But my horse knows these mountains better than anyone. He's going to get us all to safety." Thunder proved Jake right. Despite pulling a heavier load through worse conditions, the big black horse never faltered. He picked his way carefully across the snow-covered landscape, avoiding hidden dangers that Jake couldn't see. Several times, Thunder stopped suddenly and changed direction, only for Jake to discover later that they'd been heading toward a drop-off or unstable snow. When they finally reached the shelter, Jake felt a wave of relief. All three women were still alive, and they were all together now. But they weren't safe yet. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Jake knew they couldn't stay in this makeshift shelter for long. He checked on the youngest girl, and was relieved to find her awake and more alert. The mother and older daughter were also showing signs of improvement now that they were out of the car and had some protection from the wind. "Where are we?" the mother asked, looking around at the snowy wilderness. "About 2 miles from my ranch," Jake told her, "but we can't stay here. We need to get you somewhere warm with real medical help." Jake knew the next part of their journey would be the most dangerous yet. He had to get 3 weak hypothermic women across 2 miles of wilderness, in the worst blizzard Montana had seen in decades, and he had to do it before the cold claimed any of them. But as he looked at Thunder standing steady and calm despite the chaos around them, Jake felt something he hadn't felt since his military days. He felt like part of a team again. He and Thunder had trained for this without knowing it, building trust and learning each other's capabilities through months of riding in difficult conditions. "We're going to make it," he told the women, and for the first time since finding them, he actually believed it. Thunder had led him to these people for a reason, and Jake was determined not to let his faithful horse down. The hardest part of their journey was still ahead, but they were going to face it together, all of them, and somehow that made the impossible seem possible. The journey back to Jake's ranch became a test of endurance that pushed everyone to their limits. Jake had managed to get all 3 women onto the makeshift sled, with the youngest still wrapped in his coat and the other 2 huddled together for warmth. Thunder pulled steadily through the deepening snow, his powerful muscles working against the wind and cold. Jake walked alongside the sled, constantly checking on his passengers and watching for signs that anyone was getting worse. The mother, who had told him her name was Linda, kept slipping in and out of consciousness. Her older daughter, Beth, tried to stay alert to help watch over her younger sister, Amy, but Jake could see that all 3 were fighting a losing battle against hypothermia. "How much further?" Beth asked through chattering teeth. "Not far now," Jake lied. They still had over a mile to go, and the storm was making every step a struggle, but he couldn't let them lose hope. Hope was sometimes the only thing that kept people alive in situations like this. Thunder seemed to understand the urgency. The big horse moved faster than Jake had ever seen him move in snow this deep, but still carefully enough to keep the sled stable. Several times when Jake stumbled from exhaustion, Thunder would slow down and wait for him to catch up, as if the horse knew they all needed to stay together. After what felt like hours, Jake finally saw the lights of his ranch house through the swirling snow. He had never been so happy to see anything in his life. Thunder quickened his pace, sensing they were almost home. Jake's hands were so numb he could barely work the door handle, but he managed to get the ranch house open and the wood stove burning. One by one, he carried the women inside, placing them near the fire and wrapping them in every blanket he could find. The warmth of the house seemed to revive them slightly. Linda opened her eyes and looked around, confused. "Where are we?" "My house," Jake said, already reaching for his phone. "You're safe now." But when he tried to call for help, he discovered what he'd feared might happen. The phone lines were down, probably knocked out by the storm. His cell phone had no signal this far from town, especially in weather like this. They were still on their own. Jake's military medical training kicked in again. He knew the basics of treating hypothermia, but these women needed more help than he could provide. Still, he did what he could. He prepared warm drinks, heated blankets in the dryer, and monitored their vital signs. Slowly, over the next few hours, all 3 women began to improve. Color returned to their faces and their shivering gradually subsided. Amy, the youngest, was the first to fully wake up and start talking coherently. "You saved us," she said to Jake, tears streaming down her face. "We thought we were going to die in that car." "Thunder saved you," Jake corrected, looking out the window at his horse, who was now safely in the barn with extra hay and warm blankets. "I just followed his lead." As the women recovered, Jake learned more about what had brought them to that ravine. The story they told him was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Linda had been married to a man named Robert for 8 years. He wasn't the girl's biological father, but he'd been the only father figure they'd known since Amy was small. At first, he'd seemed like a good man. He had a steady job, treated the family well, and gave them a comfortable life. But things had changed gradually. Robert started drinking more. He became controlling, then angry, then violent. The abuse started small, harsh words, pushing, grabbing too hard. But it escalated over time until the family lived in constant fear. "We tried to leave before," Linda explained, her voice shaking, "but he always found us. He knew people, had connections. We never got very far." The final straw had come 3 days earlier. Robert had hurt Amy badly enough that Linda knew they couldn't wait any longer. She'd taken what money she could find, packed a few belongings, and driven away in the middle of the night while Robert was passed out drunk. "We were trying to get to my sister in Seattle," Linda said, "but we'd never driven in mountains before, especially not in snow like this." Beth picked up the story. "Mom was so tired. We'd been driving for almost 2 days straight, stopping only for gas. When the snow started getting really bad, we should have stopped and waited for it to pass, but we were scared he'd catch up to us." Amy added quietly, "We thought if we could just keep going, we'd make it to Seattle and be safe." Instead, their car had hit a patch of ice on the mountain road. Linda had lost control and they'd gone over the embankment. The car had rolled several times before coming to rest against the boulder at the bottom of the ravine. "We thought it was over," Linda said. "After the first day when no one came looking for us, we figured no one even knew we were missing." Jake realized that was probably true. If they'd been running from an abusive situation, they wouldn't have told anyone where they were going. And if Robert thought they might come back on their own, he might not have reported them missing right away. "How did you find us?" Beth asked. "I mean, what were you even doing out there in a storm like that?" Jake told them about Thunder, about how the horse had suddenly refused to follow their usual trail and had insisted on going into the forest instead. "He's never done anything like that before," Jake explained. "Usually he's very careful about staying on safe paths." Amy looked amazed. "It's like he knew we were there." "Animals can sense things we can't," Linda said softly. "Maybe he heard us calling for help, even when we thought no one could hear us." The storm continued through the night, but inside the warm house the women continued to recover. Jake made soup and hot chocolate, and gradually they all began to feel more human again. By morning the snow had stopped, though the roads were still impassable. When the phone service was restored later that day, Jake called for medical help. Paramedics arrived within an hour, along with sheriff's deputies who needed to hear the story of the rescue and the accident. The medical team confirmed what Jake had suspected. All 3 women had been suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration. Without immediate intervention, none of them would have survived another day in those conditions. "You saved their lives," the lead paramedic told Jake. "Getting them warm when you did made all the difference." But the story took an unexpected turn when the sheriff's deputies started asking questions about the accident. At first, they seemed to think it was just a case of someone driving too fast for conditions. But as they learned more about the family's situation, their focus shifted. When Linda hesitantly told them about Robert and why they'd been driving in such dangerous conditions, the deputies exchanged meaningful looks. They made some phone calls and discovered that Robert had indeed reported his family missing, but only after 3 days. His story about when and why they'd left kept changing. "We're going to need to investigate this further," one deputy told Linda. "But I want you to know that you and your daughters are safe now. We're going to make sure Robert can't hurt you anymore." As news of the rescue spread through the small Montana community, people were amazed by the story. A local newspaper reporter came to interview Jake, wanting to know more about how Thunder had led him to the trapped family. "I can't explain it," Jake told the reporter honestly. "Thunder just knew they were there. If it had been up to me, we would have stayed on our usual trail and never found them. The story made headlines throughout Montana and then across the country. People were fascinated by the idea of a rescue horse leading a veteran to save a family in distress. But for Jake, the attention felt strange and uncomfortable. What mattered to him was that Linda, Beth, and Amy were alive and safe. They stayed at his ranch for several days while authorities sorted out their situation and arranged for them to continue their journey to Seattle, where Linda's sister was waiting to help them start a new life. On their last morning at the ranch, Amy asked if she could visit Thunder one more time. Jake walked with her to the barn where the big black horse was enjoying his breakfast. "Thank you," Amy whispered to Thunder, gently stroking his neck. "You saved us when nobody else could." Thunder seemed to understand. He nuzzled Amy's shoulder gently, then turned his attention back to his hay, as if rescuing people was just part of his daily routine. As Jake watched this interaction, he realized that something important had changed for him too. For the first time since coming home from overseas, he felt like he'd done something that truly mattered. Saving those 3 women had given him a sense of purpose he'd been missing since leaving the military. Thunder had led him to them, but in a way, they had all saved each other. 6 months after the rescue, Jake's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. The story of Thunder leading him to save Linda and her daughters had spread far beyond Montana, inspiring people across the country. But the real transformation in Jake's life came from something much more personal than media attention. For the first time since returning from overseas, Jake felt like he had a purpose. The nightmares that had plagued him for years were becoming less frequent. The anxiety that once made him avoid crowds and loud noises was gradually fading. Saving those 3 women had shown him that his military training and experiences, even the painful ones, could be used to help people instead of just haunting him. Linda and her daughters had safely reached Seattle, where they were rebuilding their lives with the help of Linda's sister. They stayed in touch with Jake through letters and phone calls, updating him on their progress and thanking him repeatedly for what he'd done. "Amy started high school last month," Linda told him during one of their calls. "She's doing really well. She even joined the equestrian club because she says horses are heroes. Beth had enrolled in community college and was studying to become a paramedic. She says she wants to help people the way you helped us," Linda explained. The whole experience changed her perspective on what's important in life. But perhaps the most significant change was in Amy. The youngest daughter, who had been so close to death in that overturned car, had become an advocate for domestic violence awareness. Despite her young age, she spoke at local schools and community centers, sharing her family's story and encouraging others to seek help if they were in dangerous situations. "We learned that sometimes the scariest thing you can do is also the right thing to do," Amy said during one of her presentations. "Leaving was terrifying and we almost died because of it. But staying would have been worse. And if we hadn't left, we never would have met Jake and Thunder, who showed us that there are still good people in the world." The attention from their rescue story had also brought an unexpected development in Robert's case. After the initial investigation, authorities discovered that he'd been involved in domestic violence situations before, with previous partners who had been too scared to press charges. With Linda's testimony and the evidence from other cases, Robert was finally facing serious legal consequences for his actions. "He can't hurt anyone else now," Linda told Jake. "Knowing that makes everything we went through worth it." Meanwhile, Jake was discovering that his experience with Thunder had opened doors he'd never expected. A local veterans organization reached out to him, asking if he'd be interested in helping other returning soldiers who were struggling with PTSD and adjustment issues. "We've heard about what you and your horse did," the organization's director explained. "We think there might be something to this idea of using horses to help veterans heal." Jake was intrigued but hesitant. He'd never thought of himself as a counselor or therapist. But when he learned more about equine therapy and how horses could help people work through trauma, he began to see the possibilities. Thunder had certainly helped him heal. The big black horse had given him a reason to get up every morning, a focus for his energy, and a companion who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds. Maybe that same healing could work for other veterans too. Jake decided to give it a try. He started small, inviting a few local veterans to visit his ranch and spend time with Thunder. The results were remarkable. Men and women who had been struggling with depression, anxiety, and PTSD found that working with the gentle horse helped them in ways that traditional therapy hadn't. "There's something about being around thunder that just makes you feel calmer," explained Tom, a veteran who had served 2 tours in Iraq. "He doesn't judge you for having problems. He just accepts you as you are." Another veteran, Maria, had been having trouble sleeping since returning from Afghanistan. "When I'm here brushing thunder or just sitting with him in the barn, my mind finally gets quiet," she said. "For the first time in months, I can actually relax." Encouraged by these early successes, Jake decided to make it official. With help from the Veterans Organization and some generous donors who had heard about his story, he established the Thunder Foundation. The goal was simple: use horses to help veterans and other trauma survivors find healing and purpose. The foundation started with just Thunder and Jake's small ranch, but it quickly grew. Other horse owners donated animals that were well suited for therapy work. Mental health professionals volunteered their time to provide guidance and support. Local businesses contributed supplies and funding. Within a year, the Thunder Foundation was helping dozens of veterans each month. They offered everything from simple horse care activities to more structured therapy sessions. Some participants went on to become horse trainers or ranch hands, finding new careers that used their military discipline and teamwork skills. Jake found that running the foundation gave him something he'd been missing since leaving the Army: a sense of mission. Every day brought new challenges and opportunities to help people, just like that snowy day when Thunder had led him to Linda and her daughters. Thunder seemed to understand his new role too. The horse that had once been skittish and afraid now worked calmly with veterans who were dealing with their own trauma. He had an uncanny ability to sense when someone was having a particularly difficult day, and he'd position himself close to that person, offering his quiet, steady presence. "It's like he knows," Jake often told visitors to the ranch. "Thunder understands what it means to be broken and then put back together. He helps other people realize that healing is possible." The foundation's work caught the attention of researchers who were studying the benefits of animal-assisted therapy. They wanted to document what was happening at Jake's ranch and share the techniques with other programs around the country. "What you're doing here is remarkable," Dr. Patricia Wilson, a psychology professor, told Jake during one of her visits. "The combination of working with horses and being in a supportive community of fellow veterans is creating results we don't see in traditional settings." Jake was pleased by the recognition, but he remained focused on the individual people who came to the ranch seeking help. Each veteran who found some measure of peace and healing reminded him of why this work mattered. 3 years after the rescue, Jake received a letter that brought tears to his eyes. It was from Amy, now a senior in high school, telling him about her plans for the future. "I've been accepted to college with a scholarship to study social work," she wrote. "I want to help families who are going through what we went through. I want to be someone who shows up when people need help most, just like you and Thunder showed up for us." She went on to explain that she'd started a support group at her school for students from difficult home situations. "I tell them our story," she wrote, "about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead to the best things, if we're brave enough to keep going." Linda had also found a new purpose. She'd gotten a job working with a domestic violence shelter in Seattle, helping other women and families escape dangerous situations. "I know what it's like to feel trapped and scared," she told Jake during one of their phone calls. "But I also know that there's hope, even when everything seems hopeless." Beth had graduated from her paramedic program and was working for the local emergency services. She'd been involved in several rescues of her own, including helping save a family whose car had gone off the road during a winter storm. "Every time I help someone," Beth told Jake, "I think about that day when you found us. I think about how one person's decision to help can change everything." As Jake reflected on how far they'd all come, he realized that the rescue in the snow had been a turning point for everyone involved. Thunder had led him to save 3 lives that day, but in the process, they'd all saved each other. The veterans who came to the ranch often asked Jake about that day, wanting to hear the story of how Thunder had known to leave the safe trail and venture into the forest. Jake always told them honestly that he couldn't explain it, that some things in life were simply mysterious and wonderful. "What I do know," Jake would say, "is that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the thing that saves you is the thing you thought was broken beyond repair." Thunder was getting older now, his black coat showing touches of gray around his muzzle, but he continued his work with the veterans, still offering the same calm, steady presence that had helped Jake heal years earlier. On quiet evenings, Jake would sit with Thunder in the barn, both of them content in the peaceful silence. Sometimes Jake thought about what might have happened if he'd decided to stay inside during that blizzard, or if he'd ignored Thunder's unusual behavior and stuck to their regular trail. 3 women would have died alone in that ravine, and Jake might still be struggling with his own demons, feeling lost and purposeless. Instead, Thunder's instincts had led them all to exactly where they needed to be, a place where broken things could be mended, where people could find hope again, and where the simple act of caring for a horse could teach profound lessons about healing, trust, and the power of not giving up. The Thunder Foundation continued to grow, helping more veterans each year and